Good afternoon, everyone. We're about 2 minutes out from starting. Thanks for joining us. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marcia Lacco. For those of you who have already joined us, you hopefully recognize me. I'm the section chief over the Environmental Assistance section within North Carolina's Department of Equality's Division of Environmental Assistance and Customer Service. And the ESI program, which is putting on the EMS training, is within that section. So we are here for day 3. We're going to discuss support and operation today. Okay, so again, that's brought to you by the ESI program and our partners, Waste Reduction Partners and Land of Sky. And I threw up some new pictures from some of our ESI activities back when, so long ago, when we could do things in person. All right, so everybody should be familiar with GoToWebinar. I just wanted to highlight we had some change outs of the handout. So you've got the slides from today in that section and the design guidance workbook, which helps you if you're going to develop your EMS. And then we put up the ISO shall statements and documentation requirements, that document up again, because today we'll be talking about documentation. We have got the first 2 recordings of our first 2 sessions, but we're going to hold off on sending those out until we have all 4 so that you get them all at once. If for some reason you want one of those early, just let us know, shoot us an email, and we'll get that to you. And today you'll be hearing from myself, Angela Barger, and Don Burke. All right, so today we're going to talk about resources, competence, and awareness, communication, and documentation and document control, which are all within Clause 7. And we're going to end with operational control, environmental requirements, and outsourced processes, which are under the first section of Clause 8. All right, and just to refresh your memory about last week, we went over risks and opportunities, and just remember those are apply to more than just your impacts and aspects. We went over what is an environmental impact and aspect, which is the cause of those impacts, and introduced the life cycle perspective that's required by the standard. Don also covered compliance obligations and planning that you're required to do for those, and Angela ended the day with setting environmental objectives and went over the idea of SMART goals and how you can use that in your planning. So I didn't know if anybody had any questions that's come to their mind since last Thursday's class. Angela, are you seeing any questions coming in?
Nope, nothing yet.
All right, so we're just gonna jump right in. And so Dawn's gonna lead off for us.
Hello, everyone, and I'm just switching screens here for a moment and give you a nice little view of who I am so you put a face with the voice today. And welcome back, everyone, and I believe we have a few new attendees as well, so it's great to have you all. So thank you all for being here today. And as Marcia said, if you have any questions, or just utilize the question box or raise your hand, and even if I've advanced the slide, there's no reason why we cannot backtrack. So let me say goodbye for the video for now and bring up my screen. Let's see. Move this out of the way. There we go. Angela, Marcia, can you see my screen okay?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Let me move this down a little bit. All right, well, let's jump on in feet first. We're going to start with, oh, okay, that doesn't work. Trying to advance my screen. Well, isn't this curious? It worked fine last week. Okay.
There it goes.
Yeah, I'm using, well, it only go backwards.
You need us to take over, Dawn?
Maybe so. I'm not sure what's going on here. I can only go backwards.
Okay, hold
Yeah.
on a second. I'll take it back.
Okie dokie. All righty. Sorry, everybody.
All right, change presenter. All right, so I was busy forwarding to when I was going to speak, so hold on a second.
I think it starts on the 4th or 5th
Sorry for this technical glitch, folks. Bear with us.
Okay, there we go.
Are we good?
All right. Yep.
All right, Dawn, just say next.
Right. I'm going to enlarge the screen on my end. Okay, well, thank you everybody for your patience. I'm sure we've all experienced that one time or another in our life. Well, the ISO standard 14001, 2015 version, and clause 7.1 resources. You'll see here that the standard states that the organization shall, a reminder, or shall is indeed a requirement. So the organization shall determine and provide the resources needed for establishment, implementation, maintenance, and continual improvement of the EMS. Now, resources are needed for the effective functioning and improvement of the environmental management system and to enhance the environmental performance of such. So the top management, very important, top management should ensure that those with environmental management system responsibilities are supported with the necessary resources, right? Need the proper tool for the proper job. So internal resources may be supplemented by an external provider as well. Now, resources can include the following: human resources, natural resources, infrastructure, technology, and financial resources. Examples of human resources can include specialized skills and knowledge. Examples of infrastructure resources include the organization's buildings, equipment, underground tanks, even a drainage system, if you have that on site. Now, as a first step in ensuring that appropriate resources are available for the EMS, as I mentioned, top management must be made aware of and understand the resource needs of the organization. Okay, it's very important for top management to be involved. So identify what resources the EMS will require for your proper functioning. All right, for this, assess the level of effort your facility's current environmental tasks require. This includes forecast and any new product development plans and production plans. All right, next slide. All right, clause 7.2, competence. The standard states that the organization shall do the following. Determine the necessary competence of person or persons doing work under its control that affects its environmental performance and its ability to fulfill its compliance obligations. Okay? Ensure that these persons are competent based on appropriate education, training, or experience. And sometimes it's all of these if required. The organization shall determine training needs associated with its environmental aspects and the EMS. The organization shall, where applicable, take actions to acquire the necessary competence and evaluate the effectiveness of the actions taken. And finally, organizations shall retain appropriate documented information as evidence of competence. So the competency requirements of this ISO standard apply to persons working under the organization's control who affect its environmental performance, including persons whose work has the potential to cause a significant environmental impact, who are assigned responsibilities for the environmental management system, including those who may determine and evaluate environmental impacts or compliance obligations, those that contribute to the achievement of an environmental objective, those that respond to emergency situations, that's key, that's 24/7, those that perform internal audits, and those that perform evaluations of compliance. Now, please remember, your overall goal is to produce knowledgeable, skilled, and aware employees who assist with your facility in achieving its stated goals and objectives. You have the responsibility as part of your EMS to develop an approach to judge the competence of employees to accomplish their assigned tasks. By achieving this, I think you'll all agree, it's a win-win for everyone. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into some of these statements the further we go on. All right, next. So when determining the necessary competence of persons doing work under its control that affects its environmental performance and compliance obligations, persons doing work includes the following, as you'll see. Let me remind you though, persons doing work includes employees and contractors, okay? But you'll see here, employees, pest control, landscapers, garbage haulers with hydraulic systems. What about leaks, you know, in that task? A large volume of oil or fuel offloading, waste haulers, pump trucks, HVAC contractors, any contract. I had an interesting situation a few years back. There was a lot of flooding here in the eastern part of the state of North Carolina. And one facility I was assigned to as a regulatory inspector, they gave me a call and said, hey, we've got a contractor who'd love to stage their rigs, their 18-wheelers that they haul fuel in here on site because their home base is flooded out right now. Can we do that? You know, or do we, I was a hazardous waste inspector, so would that impact what we're doing here on site? Would we be held liable, et cetera? We had to go through that whole thing. And yeah, they had to make some agreements with this country because what if something, even though it was a temporary staging area, which actually lasted for a good month, what if something happened suddenly to those 18-wheelers? That was large volumes of oil or fuel just by sitting there in the parking lot. So they had to ensure that protocols were put in place to guard against that. But they were thinking out of the box and being proactive to a situation that may or may not happen. Now, an example could be for persons doing work, which that could say, let's start with your significant aspect, spills. Which contractors coming on site have the ability to cause a spill? We need to identify them, document the training and competency measures necessary, train them so that they know what to do or who to notify, and any environmental consequences if they create a problem, because it then becomes your problem, okay? Another example could be the organization has an objective of zero to waste landfill. So all employees who affect that goal need to be competent. You could only have janitorial service sort your recyclables, and then they would be the only ones required to be competent. However, if all of your employees do their own sorting, then everyone needs to be competent. Okay.
Don, we have a question for you.
Sure.
So the question is, what type of documents are required to prove competency?
You got it. And we're going to look a little bit in there later in this in my segment as well. I believe Marcia's as well. But documents could include certifications, training logs, whether it's in-house or out of house. So one of my examples coming up would be a wastewater treatment plant operator. If you have an NPDES permit or pre-treatment permit for treating your wastewater, your operators, do they have proper certifications? Do they get annual credits to to keep that certification going? So that's one example, but it could be paper, paper format, hard copy, your in-house database, log books. We'll talk about some training matrix and some training examples of a log keeping to do that. So it's widespread depending on what kind of certifications you may require. Some are going to be required regulatory wise, but others you may just choose to adopt them as well. And that way, and then you will have to embrace that within your EMS. I hope that answers your question, but we will dive into that a little bit later as well. So some of these, as I said, some of these you can adopt on your own, such as a certification or in-house training. Others are required by a state, county, federal level. Okay, if that's so, next slide. Next slide.
Hold on, my mouse is not.
Oh, okay.
It's not
We're having
responding like it was.
mice problems today. Yes. There we go.
All right, hold
All right,
on.
this one I guess you need to advance. There we go. So determining who needs to be competent, again, persons working under the organization's control who affect its environmental performance, including persons whose work could affect a significant environmental aspect, compliance obligation, or objective. One example would be, say, air emissions. What are your limits? How do you achieve those limits? What equipment are you using? How about maintenance and calibration? And that's something we'll talk about later on in this series as well, I think in the next week. Methods of testing. With air, this goes back to wastewater treatment plant example, except for air emissions, do you have somebody on site who are reading opacity readings through your boiler stack? Whether that's an employee who's been trained with this and got certification, or a third party, a contractor, vendor who comes on to do this. What methods are you going to use? I believe, if my memory serves me right, CFR 40, for those rules and regs, you have two methods, a method 9, method 22. I know these very well because I used to do it for years. And the kicker with this is you have to be certified every 6 months. So do you have documentation for that? Those, they actually give you a certification of such, both electronically and as a hard copy. And again, you can utilize in-house staff or contractors, but make sure they are properly certified with this. So if you're using a contract, you don't have to worry about your staff, of course, but you do still have to worry about if these contractors are legit. My company, I was a contractor, but my boss would subcontract me out for many a company in the region because no one had anybody on staff to be certified for opacity readings, because it can be a tricky test. It's something that every 6 months I did not enjoy doing, but I was successful at it, but I was glad to leave it behind. Now, and again, on a regulatory staff, if they've come to visit, you have a boiler stack, they're trying to read smoke. One thing you may want to question is, what are your certifications? Because technically, if that staff member is not certified, they cannot submit those readings. They'll have to bring somebody else back who is certified. Same goes with odors and all sorts of things. So just keep that in mind if a third party comes on site to do such testing. Additionally, persons who are responsible for the environmental management system includes those who determine and evaluate environmental impacts or compliance obligations, contribute to the achievement of environmental objective, respond to emergency situations, as I said before, very important, it's 24/7 coverage. Perform internal audits, perform evaluations of compliance. So it's best to define by position instead of employee name sometimes, or I'm familiar with, do both. You can have a dedicated form, whether that's in an electronic database or a hard copy in a notebook for each employee for proper tracking. And for each employee that shows their qualifications, their certifications, and what their responsibilities are in relation to that specific task. This is very important because if somebody leaves a position, you need to ensure that somebody can follow even in the interim, until you hire somebody permanently for that responsibility. Otherwise, that could cause you some serious compliance issues down the road. Okay, next slide.
So as you're moving forward, there was a comment from Heidi. She said, sometimes the solution may be outside of individual competence. For example, 3 tanks of chemicals filled by outside vendors. One tank had a valve fitting and that prevented the wrong truck from attaching to it, attaching a hose to pump the chemical into that tank, and the other 2 tanks had the same hose valve. Pumping into the wrong tank would result in solidifying the entire contents of the tank into an epoxy. So the solution was not making sure the delivery driver knew which tank to connect to. I guess it was actually to make sure the delivery driver knew.
Yeah,
And
actually,
then,
well,
I was just going to interject. That actually happened when I was a regulator in our Mooresville region, so near the Charlotte area. It was a textile plant, and the plant manager had left to go on lunch, but the owner was there, and so a delivery person came, and they had signage above each of the spouts on which chemical was supposed to go in, because it was on the outside of a building, and it was fed into the inside of the building where the tanks were. So the owner, not knowing process, pointed to a certain valve, and it had the different name than what the delivery person said they were delivering for. And the delivery person questioned it, and the owner was like, no, put it here. And it blew up one of their tanks. Luckily, nobody was injured. But unfortunately, that textile plant then had OSHA there. They had DEQ there. They had the fire department. And they didn't have certain permits that they were supposed to have. And unfortunately, they have since shut down. So, that really is a great example, because it can happen.
Yeah,
definitely.
and Heidi corrected me. So the answer or the solution was not to tell them which one was which, but to make sure that the connections were different for each one, so that they couldn't actually misfill the tank.
Right. Yeah, because you want a system that hopefully will keep you out of trouble rather than relying on personnel.
Yep. Absolutely.
Great example.
Yeah, I can relate to that very much. Again, back in contracting days of bulk petroleum facilities, and you guarded greatly against impurities entering, say, a tank dedicated to jet fuels versus gasoline, distillates, etc. Because that's serious business when it comes to the jet fuels, moisture levels, etc. So yeah, I appreciate that. So how do you determine necessary competence? Well, you see here education, certification, experience, and training, all of these if you choose. And Marsha, I think you can advance that a little bit as an example. Yep, and maybe one more. Yeah, so here's an example of, and again, on the training real quick before I go, I've got a little note here. For your training, both with oral and written instruction, you can attempt that. And as well as on the line training. You may have, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well, as far as having a supervisor or co-worker with more experience shadowing a trainee before they hit the actual actual manufacturer line solo. But one example is in the job description of the environmental management representative for your organization, it states that the EMR must have at least 1 year of experience working with an EMS and a 4-year college degree. So this is what has been deemed necessary competence to do the job and should be included in the EMS. So this is also referred to as a competency indicator. I've got another example of the wastewater treatment plant operator. I'm sorry about that. I've got about 15, 20 years of that in my background. But in this case, a wastewater treatment plant operator, which affects a significant aspect, who does this person need to be deemed competent? Or what does this person need to be deemed competent? Well, a lot of this is laid out, at least in North Carolina, it is, as far as proper certification in relation to the class of your plant, annual training, or credits to maintain that certification so that it won't lapse as well. And also remember, to determine as necessary competence, you must retain documentation. So I'm sorry, I can't read my writing. Anyway, documentation information as evidence of competence. Okay, so if you require an external certification or degree, you must have a record of that. Okay, and sometimes it's up to you to decide what is going to be determined. But once you do it voluntarily, you must have a record of that, and it's wrapped into your EMS. And all of this can be included in a training matrix, as I mentioned earlier, and we'll be looking at that in a little bit. All right, Marcia. So other competency indicators include the following: attendance at workshops and sessions, attendance at training, on-the-job training, direct supervisor approval of employees' competency, a quiz that can be written or oral, observation of related work and performance. So I mentioned briefly a fellow staff might be working side by side with an employee who just started. We've seen situations where some staff wear different colored safety vests to determine on what level they're at. Okay, and prior to going to the actual real-time manufacturing lines. Saw one side, it was beautiful. You have your manufacturing lines in the background, but off to the side, well, it was just a training facility, training line. And none of these products, it was actually a chemistry lab of a type, none of this would be impacting the actual manufacturing line, but it gave that employee an opportunity to go through the movements without costing the company a lot of money, and they could actually learn from their mistakes. Now remember to document these indicators to ensure that persons doing work are able to be tracked for success. Again, it's a win-win for everyone. Ensure that these planned needs are met. Also verify that the training has achieved its purpose of increased awareness. Right? I'll go admit I've been through some training that it just didn't quite do the job for me. Maybe it was the type of training, or it was maybe my brain lagging to catch on to the material. But again, there was really no follow-up to like a survey for me to address, was it effective or not? So discuss with your staff. Are the staff happy with the training? Does training teach the required skills or concepts? Are the skills and concepts used on the job? Or are they outdated? Is it an outdated SOP, etc.? Does the application of the skills and concepts have positive effects? Again, this is tailored for success for all. All right, next slide. Yeah, and you can go down one more. Yeah. So determining training needs associated with aspects in EMS. All right. Well, environmental aspects. You have spill prevention and response. This is both for in-house and contractors. Hazardous waste management. Well, that's a handful. You have handling of hazardous waste, disposal of hazardous waste. How about the signing of manifest? Does that require specialized training? How about filling out the logs and records? The transportation of, is that in-house or is that is that a vendor doing that? Painting operations, again, handling of the product, paint. How about the filters? How are you going to dispose of those? Has a waste determination been provided? The disposal and cleaning of the painting elements throughout. Air permit requirements, well, from your limits to your reporting to calibrations. SOPs, biggest thing I've seen everywhere, even when I first started decades ago. Are they up to date? One of the places I worked, as soon as you, a new, this was a laboratory, analytical chemistry water laboratory, and as soon as they hired somebody new, it was about 10 people on staff, their job was to review every single SOP and safety guidance and update it. Check it for mistakes, or is it easy to understand, especially somebody just coming onto the site. Environmental management system. Well, you have your internal auditor. That's in-house audits to ensure your EMS is up to date and effective. Your EMS, such as our ESI module training for ISO 14001. And by the way, we've already got ours on the books, I believe, from July through December. On that one, we slice and dice the standard in small segments, and it's incorporated with many exercises, et cetera. But these are available through an organization such as North Carolina's ESI, or even a contractor, a vendor. Leadership, top management and down, to ensure that your EMS is up to date and effective. Again, top manager, can't say enough about it, and I'll touch base on that again in a minute, because it also goes in a different direction with top management. It's a two-way street with the staff and the top, those supporting the EMS. So remember, awareness for the EMS is needed for all employees, okay? All employees. And we'll be addressing awareness here in a bit as well. Next slide. So documentation. For this requires that the organization shall retain appropriate documented information as evidence of competence. And so document the following: who needs to be competent? Your job titles, include your contractors, what is necessary competence of that job, document that. Right? Again, I used the example of a hazardous waste because that's many people sometimes are involved with that. The inspections, the logs, inspecting the accumulation areas, handling of the hazardous waste, signing your manifest, transportation of, checking your spill kits, you name it. And then again, this can be electronic database, hard copy. A lot of these stations, such as your accumulation areas, you may have hard copy logs right there. So you walk up to it, there's your documentation. You can then transcribe it elsewhere if need be. All right. Requires that evidence that the person doing that job is indeed competent. Again, these are tracking records that you can utilize, and make sure you check the frequencies of training. Again, I've got a nice example of that for you. We'll go over here in a little bit. Do not let these the frequency of training fall to the wayside. And especially when a new employee comes on board, how much time are you going to give them? Is it within a week, 2 weeks, 30 days to undergo your internal training? What are the training needs for jobs associated with significant aspects and the EMS? So this helps one understand their impacts regarding the EMS. Right? They come to work, they're on their line. Do they understand what impacts could come from their workday that day? Evidence of actions taken to acquire the necessary competence and evaluate the effectiveness of the actions taken. Right? Again, this goes to tracking records as well. So I believe that's, we can go to the next slide. We'll talk about that. So this is an example of a training needed matrix. As it states here, in order for employees to be deemed competent, they must have undergone the following training and meet additional competency requirements. Pretty nice form. And again, nothing's cookie cut. You all are special in what you do in different ways. We do not cookie cut anything. So you could take an example like this, format it so that it fits your needs, your business model. So you have department or the job position or the employee. I've seen this with both the department and the employees' names. Some of them, they have each employee on staff has a dedicated record for them with their job description, right? So we've got, for some examples, your ISO 14001 awareness, evacuation plan, your spill prevention and response, goes on and on. Hazardous waste, one of my favorites there, hazardous material shipping for DOT, painting operations, goes on, internal auditing, and any additional competency requirements. And then what I really love about this is the very bottom, the frequency of training. Because of some regulatory divisions, that does go through a fine-tooth comb. That's something I've had to look at for many years. You know, I'll ask for, say, 6 employees, just out of blue. I don't know them. Bring me the training records of these 6 employees, and then we'll do a paper trail. You know, are they up to date? Especially on that frequency of training. That's usually the biggest thing that's out of kilt. The frequency of training has gone, whether it's a day or a week or a month, over. So some facilities have developed a database that will actually alarm them 30 days out from a due date. Hey, they'll let you know, hey, Don's got 30 days before this certain type of training is required. So you contact that employee, and there you go, get it done and document it. Now, this typically can save you a lot of, it can also help you with the regulatory side as well. As an auditor, an inspector, some of the things, even if they're not requesting it, it's something to show off and to be proactive with. Now, some use, again, a database that tracks employment travel. I've just mentioned they signal when the employees are within 30 days or so of the deadline. Right. Let's go to the next slide. What this one is an example of a training form. Right. It's got an area for competent sign-off as well. Job position, date hired, the skills, equipment, or awareness areas that's needed. Is it related to a significant aspect? That's wonderful, especially for your EMS. Level of competency. Right. Your training records. Beautiful. Again, you can this isn't cookie cut. You can formulate something like this that will meet your business needs. And especially it depends on the number of employees you have. You know, it's easier if you've got a dozen or so, if you're a small business, but if you've got 500 employees, then yeah, you may want to consider a database. That's all inclusive, much easier to deal with. And again, EMS or audits or inspections, it doesn't matter if it's database or hard copy. Some places do both. Some places the hard copies are their backups, you know, to their electronic databases. So remember, if you don't back it up with a hard copy, just make sure your electronic database does indeed have a backup, whether it's in the cloud, etc. Because sometimes, somewhere, something just may go wrong. You may have a glitch. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, let's move on to 7.3, awareness. The standard states that the organization shall ensure persons doing work under the organization's control are aware of the following: the environmental policy, the significant aspects and the related impacts associated with their work, their contribution to the effectiveness of the EMS, including benefits of enhanced environmental performance, and implications of not conforming with the EMS, including not fulfilling compliance obligations. Now, awareness of the environmental policy should not be taken to mean that the commitments need to be memorized, or that the persons doing work under the organization's control have a copy of the documented environmental policy. Rather, these persons should be aware of its existence, its purpose, and their role in achieving the commitments, including how their work can affect the organization's ability to fulfill its compliance obligations. Now, some of these I'm going to repeat, but just remember the awareness training should include your environmental policy. I mentioned the contribution to the effectiveness of the environmental management system. This includes your objectives and goals, your compliance obligations, how they can help with continual improvement, the key to the EMS. A training could be done company-wide. It could be done by description or area of work. Training could be done annually, quarterly, or monthly. You get to decide that. But once you do commit to that, make sure it's adhered to within your EMS. Now, I mentioned policy statement availability. Well, having the policy highly visible helps to maintain awareness. You can provide an employee with a personal copy or a pocket version, a payroll insert. And we have seen that. Some have the little pocket versions on the back of their ID tag that's on their lanyard around their neck. You can locate it in the areas where it will be seen regularly, such as the lobby, break areas, cafeterias, copiers, obvious areas of waste generation where people will be going to. Many times as a regulator, I would start my inspection right there in the lobby waiting for my contact, because I would see beautiful copies of their ISO standards, various standards from 9,000, 14,001, etc. And lo and behold, there's a policy statement on the wall. You know, while I'm waiting, I'm documenting, and this is all good stuff to document, giving the company credit for this. Right? When vendors, contractors may come in, potential customers, they get to see the exact same thing. Now, 4, 5. So contractor awareness is something I like to expand on. How might you ensure contractors are aware? And I've got a question for you, maybe hoping for some feedback here in just a moment. But so how might you ensure contractors are aware? Well, one example is at the entrance, have all visitor and contractors watch a short training video that goes over the environmental policy, the significant environmental aspects, impacts associated with their work, their contribution to the effectiveness of the environmental management system, the implications of not conforming with the environmental management system requirements. So we've got one site in North Carolina where they're scratching their heads on to spread the news on their EMS and making sure that contractors that come on site adhere to this. It's a pretty busy area. I'll say it's a landfill drop off of sorts. And you have multiple drivers of the same company that may come in, drop off their waste stream and leave. And they're really wanting to make sure everybody's adhering to the EMS because they've had some impacts occur in the past, so they're trying to spread the word. Problem is, there may be a high turnover rate with these contractors. They can call the parent company, but does the word really filter down to everybody, every driver? So does anybody have any ideas on, say, a landfill situation? We have constant trucks coming in and out, drivers every day, may not be the same ones every time. How are we going to make them aware of the EMS and that it's adhered to? And you may think that the company, my personal belief would be, they would be inspired to adhere to the facility's EMS if they want to keep their business, right? If they want to, keep being a contract to that site. If anybody has any insight to that, what are other ways to spread awareness of EMS to a third party, to a vendor, a contractor? If anybody has any feedback, feel free to let us know. And if anybody does, we'll come backtrack to that as well. The intent, remember, the intent of this clause is to ensure that employees at all levels of the organization understand the policy and principles of the EMS and the ways in which their job activities impact the environment and the achievement of EMS goals, which obviously includes meeting compliance obligations. Okay. Now, another example would be, say, a zero waste to landfill goal. If all employees should know about the goal and how they contribute to achieve that goal. The implications of not conforming with the EMS requirements, not achieving goals, not maintaining compliance, environmental impacts, etc. Now, zero waste to landfill can be interrupted a great deal with impurities introduced into waste stream. And where your waste stream goes, it can be easily rejected due to that. And this could be something as simple as cafeteria, trash containment. Are they properly recycling items? And because if suddenly metals are going into plastics are going into paper materials, etc., the company come picking that up, well, they may want to have a talk to you because it's just not occurring. They don't have the staff or the time or the ability to straighten out the mistakes there in-house. Okay, I think we can go ahead. So 741, communication, in this case, general communication. When establishing its communication processes, the organization shall take into account of compliance obligations, ensure communicated environmental information is consistent with information generated in the EMS and is reliable. And the organization shall respond to relevant communications on its EMS. So communication allows the organization to provide and obtain information relevant to its EMS, including information related to its significant environmental aspects, environmental performance, compliance obligations, and recommendations for continual improvement. Communication is a two-way process in and out of the organization. So organizations shall establish, implement, and maintain the processes needed for internal and external communications relevant to the EMS. This includes on what it will communicate, when it will to communicate, with whom to communicate, and how to communicate. So when establishing its communication processes, the internal organizational structure should be considered to ensure communication with the most appropriate levels and functions. And this I love. A single approach can be adequate to meet the needs of many different interested parties, or multiple approaches might be necessary to address specific needs of individual interested parties. Nothing cookie cut about this. Okay, we can go on. Let's see. Have you clicked ahead?
I did, Don. Should be seeing communication general.
Yeah, I just went over that. Yeah. We should be seeing the communication log, which is next.
Oh, we
There we
probably
go.
just one behind.
No problem. Oh, you were right on the last one. So anyway, so 741, communication continued. The organization shall retain documented information as evidence of its communications as appropriate, a record, right? So this is one way to document your communications on your EMS through a communications log, okay? You'll see your date, your name, the company. This is the initial communication on your left side, phone and email address, subject of communication. And then on the right, response, the date, action taken, employee initials. I think you'll all agree that, hey, it's easy to fill out the left side. We got problems though if the responses aren't taken care of. That's where you don't want to see any blanks. So don't forget to follow up. Okay, it may take numerous follow-ups. That's fine. You just keep documenting away. Now remember, communications will help the following. You can motivate the workforce. You can explain the environmental policy, both internally and externally, and how it relates to the overall business visions and strategy. You can assure understanding of rules and expectations. You can demonstrate management commitment. That's so important. Monitor performance, and it can identify potential system improvements. Continual improvement, that is indeed. Now, an inability to communicate effectively with the first few hours of an incident could seriously reduce the company's ability to control the situation. Yes, indeed. I'll follow up on that here in a moment. This could undermine the company's reputation with staff, customers, media, the public. Remember, effective environmental management requires effective communications. It's always a work in progress. That's what continual improvement is all about. You know, a few years ago, there was a food processing company, very popular in the state, and they had an NPDES permit discharged right out to a river that led out to to the Atlantic Ocean, and things are going fine. It's a wonderful company, but all of a sudden the town started getting these odor complaints. I mean, they were bad. I didn't really appreciate it when the first time I came out there. And this is all industrial wastewater now. There's nothing domestic about it. I finally went out there after weeks of bad press. They didn't know what to do. It turns out they just weren't relaying all the information they needed to. You take a tour through the processing area, nothing's amiss, not a thing. Products were fine, nothing's wrong. Then you take a tour out through the to the collection system and the wastewater treatment plant area, all the way out through the effluent. That's where your issues were. And it was a simple matter of cleaning out some lagoons that they had. And these weren't your typical lagoons, very well taken care of. Great industrial setting, it really was. But the effluent suddenly was the same color as the lagoons. It was orange. That's not right. You know, it's usually crystal clear water. You know, something's going on with organics. It took weeks to uncover the mystery of, well, one of the operators wanted to dislodge some sludge out of these two lagoons and, you know, just get rid of it. Problem is it released, oh, everything you can imagine as far as odor wise and stuff that's been built up for 10, 20 years, and it impacted the effluent greatly. We would go down miles downstream, no discoloration of the water after a while, but guess what the dissolved oxygen levels were? Zero, flatlined. This went miles and miles down the river. And so from there, you got to contact any interested parties downriver. You've got to come clean with the media and the public. And that was a public relations nightmare. If they had just simply disclosed what they had suspected in the beginning, okay, mistakes happen. But when you drag it on for weeks and months, and I'm not going to disclose any more because I don't even know if that case is closed. And it was really sad. It was a huge PR hit. If they had just been upfront at the beginning with their communications, both internally, because that wasn't clear internally, and especially externally. Okay, next slide. Internal communication, 742. Okay. The organization shall internally communicate information relevant to the EMS among the various levels and functions of the organization, including changes to the EMS as appropriate. Ensure its communication processes enables which persons doing work under the organization's control to contribute to continual improvement. Now, this is new to the 2015 standard in relation to 2004. So how might you meet this requirement? Well, ensuring communication processes for persons doing work under the organization's control to contribute to continual improvement. That's something you might want to ask yourself. You may already have it embedded in your EMS. So always remember, do you have contractors performing activities out of hours? I experienced situations where they generally knew we were there. Shoot, yeah. I mean, we're traveling, you know, anywhere from I was based out of Charlotte, you know, in North Carolina, traveling probably 25 states a year. Oklahoma, Maine, Florida, you name it, many times over during the year. So they're going to know we're there. Sometimes they forgot where we were, and that's a health issue. That you know, whether it's pockets of ammonia, you know, respirators required, electrical challenges, or storm events. A lot of times they just lost tabs of us, especially at the larger facilities. So keep tabs on that. Maybe have a dedicated employee, a staff to shadow. You know, you realize you may not be able to spend all your time with the group, but you can at least check on them every now and then, make sure everything's going okay. Do they have any needs? Are there any safety issues, etc.? There are some sites that as soon as we came aboard the property, oh, they went through all of our equipment with a fine-tooth comb to make sure everything was appropriate. Electrical cords, you know, if a plug had been replaced due to it being frayed in the past, no, they didn't like that. They confiscated it. Guess what? We implemented that in future jobs and ongoing as part of our continual improvement. We knew for any organization, whether they checked or not, what to include and what to not to include in our stock. So internal communication includes the following: communicating environmental objectives and targets to employees. Okay, includes raising awareness of environmental issues to employees. Includes communicating the environmental policy to employees, which we've mentioned. And again, they don't have to read it back word for word. We want to hear it. If they're aware of it, can you explain certain elements of it in your own language, in your own thought process? That's what we're looking for. If you don't have a copy on you, which you're not required, do you know where it is? Do you know that it exists? Do you know where it is? And many of them, yeah, you could point, yeah, it's over there at my supervisor's office, right there posted outside. And that's wonderful. Oh, and of course, you know, can they repeat or communicate to you their impacts on that very day that they come to work, put their hands on their equipment? If anything goes wrong, is there environmental impact? Can they express that to you? I love that part of our job when we were able to go out to sites, and we will again. That's part of our job when helping them with the OMS, is to interview staff out on the floor, from top management down to the manufacturing line. I love that.
So,
Uh-huh.
Don, Andrea had a comment. She said an example of evidence of internal communication could be emails sent inside the organization to show improvement of environmental significant aspects.
You got it. Wonderful experience. Another that some of our member sites are using is Microsoft Teams. So thank you for that example, because that's jogged my memory on that. There's many tools and Teams that we're still learning about, where it's an in-house segment for their employees for improvements, suggestions, concerns, reporting impacts, etc. So yes, emails, an IT platform such as Teams. Thank you very much. Yep. Internal communication also includes reporting of incidents, well, as I just mentioned, arising from abnormal or emergency operation to senior management. This is part of continual improvement. This is that two-way street that I was mentioning for both in-house staff or contractors. Okay, it's a two-way street. How's top management or senior management going to know if it's not reported? Now, again, thank you so much for the example, because got jotted down some notes. It's to be done via emails, Microsoft Teams, memos, staff meetings, which can be virtual now or in person, training activities. Next week I'll be touching base on gimbal walks. I believe the translation is the real place where management goes down to manufacturing areas, or they have meetings with the entire staff and see where all the action takes place. They put their eyes on it, not necessarily their hands, figuratively, but you don't want to mess with gears and moving belts, but you can really appreciate the work going on in your business, in your facility. So yeah.
Heidi also commented, she said, there's always the old trick of posting a company newsletter or other information on the inside of a toilet stall door.
Oh, great.
She says she's seen that more than once and read what was posted, and I have too, especially like the policy. I've seen that on the back side of a door, and that's an awesome place for it. So
definitely. I think I mentioned, cafeterias, maybe water fountain. Didn't think of the restrooms. That's wonderful. Why not? It's reading material. So great. Yeah, we can think out of the box all day. It's excellent.
Don, I was just going to remind us, we also had one of our wastewater treatment plants. They have little, I don't know if you want to call them tents, little tents. They're not paper. They were made of plastic, but you could put paper in them. And they had them on their conference room tables so that when they went in there, they talked about their environmental EMS.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a big world out there. A lot of great ideas. All right, let's move on to 743. External communication. Well, the standard states that the organization shall externally communicate information relevant to the EMS as established by the organization's communication process or processes and as required by its compliance obligations. Now you'll see here that it's similar to 2004 standard that required you to establish, implement, and maintain a procedure for receiving, documenting, and responding to relevant communications from external interested parties. It's similar that way. It differs in that from the 2004 standard, as it stated that the organization shall decide whether to communicate externally about its significant environmental aspects and shall document its decision. Okay. Now, communication allows the organization to provide and obtain information relevant to its EMS, including information related to its significant environmental aspects, environmental performance, compliance obligations, and recommendations for continual improvement. Again, communication is a two-way process. It's for success. Yes, indeed. All right. Next slide. All right. So, external communication. Well, the environment, the information received by the organization can contain requests from interested parties for specific information related to the management of its environmental aspects, or can contain general impressions or views on the way the organization carries out that management. Now, these impressions or views can be positive or negative. Now, in the latter case, such as complaints, it is important that a prompt and clear answer is provided by the organization. A subsequent analysis of these complaints can provide valuable information for detecting improvement opportunities for the EMS. Again, these are improvement opportunities. That's how I've always, and I've been on both sides. Both sides. I've been inspected while working in a lab, at water plants, waste treatment plants. As a contractor, we had, I know that we covered at least 25 states a year, and some countries abroad, but mainly for the U.S., we always had a state representative show up and look at what we're doing. And I was never offended by this. These are improvement opportunities. You're going to have good days and bad days. Things are going to happen. A pump's going to break or die and all that good stuff. But it's an opportunity. That's how you need to reframe this. Some people dread it. I don't. There were days that I'm like, oh gosh, I saw that white car with the yellow plates pull in, and not right now. Things aren't going too great. But more often than not, they were. It's an opportunity to show off on those days. But on the days when there were things going wrong, equipment failures, et cetera, you just learned from it and you moved on from that. So do you have a policy on what company information may be shared on employee social media accounts? Oh, wow. I know what I do. I just don't have any social media accounts, but many people do. Many people, something to keep in mind. This happened at a company, it was not an ESI member or anything. Just, I know somebody who works for this company, and they were on a social media platform and talking about something rather controversial, not about the company, but guess what? They were wearing the company shirt. And there was right there on their upper left, plain as day. What about ID badges when you're doing this? You may want to expand upon that and make sure that they are a representative of your business. So external communications include dealing with environmental complaints or proactively inviting such stakeholders or even green pressure groups to the site. Now, the green pressure groups, I've handled that with, it was a beautiful process. Didn't start off well. They had some issues going on with the processes. They got them fixed. And this is when I was an inspector. And then I was champion for them. I carried their flag for them. It was wonderful. The first couple of years were difficult, but from then on, they invited everybody onto their property. They now wanted to show off the improvements, and they finally got the message, and they're proud to be part of that community. Okay. External communications also include responding to media inquiries, especially in the event of an incident. Now, make sure you have a dedicated person or persons for this. Nobody had to teach me what to do when media wanted to approach me for an interview. No, I know how to relegate that to where it should go. And that's on every level of platform I've worked on. So keep that in mind. Be careful. Make sure you know that your in-house staff know the proper protocols for that. I know Shoot, I'm going to my supervisor, section chief, Marcia, and then we're going to the PIO, or she may go to the director, and properly direct those inquiries where they should be going. There's a multitude of media available for this communication, as you can see on this slide, okay? And even more so. All right, 7.4.
Also,
Your commute. Go ahead.
sorry. I was just going to say, you also, when you're considering external communication, remember that the reports that you make to regulatory agencies should also be included in your plan for communication.
Yeah.
And you mentioned personal social media, but there's also like organization social media accounts as well. So if you're putting things out there that affect your EMS, you should include that in your policy, or not your policy, but your procedure for your external communication. We had an example of that with our local government who does solid waste. They use social media to kind of help educate the community on what should and shouldn't be recycled. And so that was actually a big part of their EMS, because that's what they do. You know, they take recycling and solid waste and they get it to the right places. And so they needed to make sure that they included that within their EMS as well. So just wanted to mention those.
I appreciate that, Angela. Thank you so much. I'm jotting down a note there. All right, well, 7.4, your communication should be transparent. Right? Why not? The organization is open in the way it derives what it has reported on. Okay. Be appropriate. Information meets the needs of relevant interested parties, enabling them to participate. Right? Be truthful and not misleading to those who rely on the information reported. Be factual, accurate, and able to be trusted. Do not exclude relevant information, and be understandable to interested parties. So remember, interested parties is defined as a person or organization that can affect, be affected by, or perceive itself to be affected by a decision or activity. And as I said this earlier, a single approach can be adequate to meet the needs of many different interested parties, or multiple approaches might be necessary to address the specific needs of interested parties. And that's something you'll find along the way on who and when you deal with these interested parties. All right, that's all I've got right now, unless there's any other questions.
Okay, and I just wanted to interject, Don, because this used to be my section. I believe I took these bullets from the annex of the standard, so this is sort of guidance that the folks that put the standard together wanted to make sure anyone implementing it got.
Yeah, I highly recommend. I enjoy the annex and the standard. So if you do have a copy, please make sure you go through that. And a lot of great information. So, all right.
All right, Angela, any questions before we move on?
Not seeing any.
All righty.
Well,
okay.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Don. Great job. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit. So we've mentioned documentation from the very beginning of the standard, but we finally got to the clause here back in section 7. So our first slide just sort of highlights the first 3, show you how documentation is arranged in the new standard. So it's only 3 sections. Whereas in the old standard, they had broken apart documents versus records. And the requirements were split between the implementation and operation section, as well as what was known as the checking section in the old standard. So just the way they organize it is a little different. All right, so they did also switch up the terminology when they did the 2015 update. So the word documented information replaces what was used in the old standard, the 2004 version, which was documentation, documents, and records. And so in the new standard, and you've heard us say it already, retain documented information as evidence of. That last 3 word, as evidence of, is what tells you that it's a record. Versus maintaining documented information, that just means documentation such as SOPs, signage, things like that. And in the annex, it notes that, as evidence of is not meant to point to any legal or evidentiary requirements. It's just to say that you have to have a record, right? You know, the old phrase, if you didn't write it down, you didn't do it. So that's what that's pointing to. And just wanted to point out, if you've had a standard for a while, you don't have to change your terminology. So you can still call it documents and records, as long as you're still meeting those shall statements. But, if you're going through, you're looking at your EMS and you're looking to see, maybe we should revamp things. It might not be a bad idea to consolidate things, because I think the new standards makes it easier for folks with regard to their documentation. All right, so in section 751, it says the organization's EMS shall include documented information required by the ISO standard, right? We'll be going over this later. You've got that shall document, but there's 15 spots where it requires documented information. And then any documented information determined as necessary for the effectiveness of your EMS, and it's Don has been stating throughout his section, it's not cookie cutter. Each organizations can have differences about what you determine the documentation you need to make sure your EMS is operating effectively and that you have the records you need to show you're doing what you say you're doing. All right. So the new standard breaks it down into creating and updating, which is section 7.5. And so it says, the standard says, when you create and update your document information, you shall ensure that you have appropriate identification and description. So that means you're going to have a title, you're going to have a date, who is writing whatever that particular document is, give it a reference number. So the most recent one of our members that we've been working with, they have a really interesting way to identify their SOPs. So if they have SOPs that are related to, like, let's say a procedure, if they're going out and they're going to do inspections related to their stormwater permit, they have an SOP for that. Whereas the SOPs that are related to how their EMS itself works, they called an SEOP, so an environmental operating procedure. So that's an easy way for folks within their organization to know, is this something related directly to how the EMS works, or is it directly related to something that we do on a daily basis? The other thing you're going to want to make sure you appropriate is the format, right? So we have quite a few of our members have employees where English is not their primary language. So sometimes you may have to translate an SOP or translate some signage. And a lot more of our members are going to electronic versions of their EMS, right? So does everyone in your organization have the correct software to make sure they're reading it if they have to access it electronically? And we do still have some folks that have paper versions of their EMS, so they may have a whole EMS manual that goes out with their staff because they go to locations where they're not going to have computer access, or they don't maybe not have cell phone access, or access to get to that electronically. Or you may be sending folks out to take records related to inspections. Are you putting that on that specialized paper that lets you write in the rain? And do you have, they make special pens that allow you to write when it's wet out on a piece of paper, so consider some of those things. Or, or signage in an area where, it could be getting dirt or something else on it where you want to protect it. And then the last thing it requires is that you have a system to review and approve your documentation for suitability and adequacy, right? So if an SOP relates to a certain part of your facility, who within that section is going to be responsible for reviewing it. And how is that done? Who has the ultimate say, and then whose signature is the one once that's on that SOP or whatever documentation is. Once that's done, it's deemed adequate and it can be put into use. All right, and then we roll into 753, which is controlling your documented information. So the standard says you shall be controlled to ensure it is available and suitable for use where and when it is needed, right? So the folks that are using those SOPs, or it might be a job aid, or as Dawn noted, your policy, is it where the folks that need it can get to it? Lots of times when we go out and we interview folks, we'll ask them, what do you do? How do you know how to do your job? And if they point to either an SOP or a job aid, we'll go through that. We'll make sure if they tell us it's in their supervisor's office, we'll go there and we'll make sure that, we can actually get to that information. And if it's in an area that, like I said, outside, it could be also inside where it gets dirty, so is it laminated? Is it in those flexible plastic envelopes, or something more rigid? And is it the latest version? And then is it adequately protected from improper use? So, so if someone has to print something out from your electronic system, does it say in the header or the footer, this is an uncontrolled document, please refer, to the system document for the most recent version. Loss of integrity. So if it's a record, how long do you have to keep it? Is it written in pen where that ink may not stand up if it has to be kept for a long time? When I worked for the Department of Energy, our retention schedule was 75 years. So that's a really long time to keep a record and make sure you're not losing any integrity. And then again, exposed to the weather. All right. And then the standard goes on further regarding control of documentation. You will address the following activities as applicable. So how do you distribute it? Is it electronic? Do you have those paper copies? Who's responsible for distributing it if it has a paper copy? How do folks access it? Electronically? Do they have the paper? Do they have to go to someone? How do you retrieve it and how do you use it? I already spoke a little bit to storage and preservation and ensuring that preservation of legibility. Change of control, so your version control, your revision dates. The folks that we just work with, they put a stamp on there, and then the EMR, their environmental management rep, is responsible for signing it and dating it, and that's when it's official for them. And then retention and disposition. So a lot of times folks will rely on regulatory requirements for how long you keep a permit. So I come from an NPDES clean water background. So in North Carolina, that's only required 3 years unless it's a lab record, and that's 5 for us. But when I was a regulator, we had an instance where it was a really large discharger who had an individual permit, and there were some questions about what levels of a certain metal they were discharging because it was going into a body of water that was deemed as a drinking water source. So we had a meeting with them, and although the permittee only had to keep their records for 3 years, in one of our DEQ regional offices, we had a much bigger historical records related to it. So we had multiple versions of their permit. And so before we went to that meeting, I was in charge of reviewing their record and looking at their history of, what was their discharge limits for this particular metal. And so when we met with them, it was kind of surprising because the company did not do that same historical review. They only were aware of their most recent permit. So that's one of the things that we bring up when we do this class for our members is, even though you may not be required to keep copies of permits, it might be in your best interest to make sure you have that historical record and you know the history of how your permit has changed over time, because you never know when that a discussion about that could come up for you. And then the last thing that I wanted to highlight is probably the thing that we have seen the most and we've talked the most to our members about. And the standard says that documented information of external origin, determined by the organization to be necessary for the planning and operation of the EMS shall be identified as appropriate and controlled. So what does that mean? We have some folks that have permits in North Carolina. Our industrial stormwater permits require you to use a specific form. So the conversation got started with one of our members about how are you ensuring that your staff is using the correct form? And when it says there it needs to be controlled, that doesn't mean you have to bring it into your document control system and give it a number. You can control it just by, someone every so often, maybe every 12 months, you go and you review what is either in the permit or what the regulatory division is providing the version of the form on their website, and you make sure you're using the right one. And then you just document that check. There's multiple ways which you can control documents. Another example is our friends in the solid waste. They have large machinery that they operate at their landfill location. And one of the things they do is they point to the manufacturer's operations and owners manuals as the way that they're going to maintain that equipment and make sure it's not discharging and it's tip-top condition. So that was another discussion we had with them. Is that a document, or do you need to point to a website? How do your folks know if they're doing the maintenance that they're doing it per what the manufacturer says? And that's another thing that, if you're using a manual, you need to make sure you control that some way. I think these guys, they were looking and doing it in-house, and then they outsourced that to the actual manufacturer. So they were able to get rid of that piece of their documents of external origin. And as it says, be identified. So they came up with a list of the different areas of their documents that came from external origin. And I'd be remiss if I didn't note permits, right? So a lot of times, I'm sure we've got a lot of different states on here. North Carolina is transitioning to not providing a paper copy of a permit, but doing that via email and electronic distribution of permits. So you as a permittee, if you are a permittee, you need to make sure that once you get that permit, that everyone that has in your organization that can touch it or is related to us, if it's a significant aspect, they know which version of the permit you have and how to make sure that they're in compliance with it. So those are just some of the examples that we've seen of those documents of external origin that you need to be thinking about and making sure that you're managing within your EMS. All right, so this is just a summary for you guys. You have that document that we did, but this is also another place. If you're going along and implementing your EMS, you can refer back to this. So the places where the standard says you must have mandatory documents are your scope and your policy, those risks and opportunities that need to be addressed that Angela discussed with you last class, your identification and evaluation of your environmental aspects, those compliance obligations that you've identified, your objectives and plans for achieving them, any of your operational control procedures, and then your emergency preparedness and response procedure. And then places where you have to have those records, where the standard says as evidence of. So Don just spoke to you about your competence of personnel, your training records, or any other records that you identify you need to make sure your employees and your contractors are competent. Your evidence of communication, records related to your monitoring performance, but also the calibration and any other records from your monitoring and measurement. Your evaluation of compliance, We haven't talked about it yet, but your internal audit program implementation and its results, your management review results, and then your nonconformities and corrective actions. So I think it's about evenly split between documentation and records, those 15 places where the standard requires it. All right, so that's it for documentation. Next up, Angela will talk about operational planning and control.
Alrighty, I think it's probably a good place for a break. So why don't we take 15 minutes? We don't have an exercise for you to do in the middle of it. So if you want to go exercise for 15 minutes, that's up to you. But let's see, it's 2:23, so let's say 38. So we'll say come back at 2:40 or whatever that translates to in your time zone. So we'll be back in about 15 minutes. All right. Welcome back, folks. We'll give everybody just a couple more minutes to get settled and back to thinking about ISO. Okay, I have 22. Marsha or Dawn, can you confirm that you're seeing my slides?
Yes, I see it just fine, Angela.
Perfect. All righty. So we're going to talk about operational planning and control now for the rest of the class, and which probably means we're going to end early, which I know hurts all of your feelings, but we'll go ahead and get started with that piece. So we've kind of broken this section down into about 4 parts. So it's going to be kind of, I give you a little bit of chunk and then I'll explain it and then give you a little bit more. So in this case, the standard starts off with the organization shall establish, implement, control, and maintain processes needed to meet your EMS requirements and implement actions identified in your risks and opportunities and your aspects and impacts and your compliance obligations and your objectives. So that those full sections, you know, if you said you needed to do something, then this is the element that is saying, okay, what are you going to do? And you're going to do that by establishing your operating criteria for your process and implementing control of the processes. So this is no longer just for significant aspects like it was in 2004. Now it's looking at all of those other pieces that you've identified that need to be controlled in some way. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. We're looking at this one as bulletproofing your EMS. You know, what is the operating criteria of your process? So in this particular case, the organization shall establish and control is talking about what kinds of things you need to do in order to make sure that your EMS is functioning the way it needs to in order to help you get to that continual improvement, right? Making sure that folks are doing the processes needed to reduce your impact. And then the organization shall maintain documented information to the extent necessary to have confidence that the process has been carried out as planned. So you're putting that plan in place, then you have to have evidence that you have implemented that plan. And it's not enough to just establish those controls. You know, anybody can write an SOP or a work instruction for how to do something, but you have to make sure that those controls are being carried out the way you meant for them to be. And that's the implementation piece. And you have to maintain evidence that it's being carried out. So that's your documentation piece. So here's an example. We have an airplane lavatory waste disposal, right? So you've got these folks that come out to the airplanes between their different runs and they remove the waste from the planes, right? So you can see they have all kinds of PPE on. There's like a locking mechanism to make sure the hose stays attached to the plane so you don't get spills. You can see that they chalk the wheels on that truck back there to make sure it doesn't roll away, and disconnect that hose, which also is a safety issue if it were to like run into a person or get in the line of traffic of a plane. So there are lots of different pieces that are associated with this. And here's just another view of a different type of system. Looks like it's a manual release there with her pulling down on it. So just keep these things in mind as we're going to go through another example later. But they'll take that material that they have in those trucks and they'll bring it to a place, right, like the one you're seeing here on the screen. And that grate that you see on the floor, they'll park the truck over that grate and then empty the material in there. And what's inside of there is what they call a commutator, and it's a grinder basically to make sure that the materials are broken up in a way that it can flow well. And then there are some chemical treatments that are possible that may need to be done before it can be released into the sanitary sewer. So there's lots of different ways that people can handle the operational control on this, right? So you could have different work instructions, you could have signage, you could have all kinds of things, right? So what kind of controls might you think about for that? And what kind of documentation might be necessary in order to show that the process is carried out as planned? Does anybody have any good ideas? So like I said, you can definitely have work instructions, but a lot of times this operation is carried out by contractors. So while the equipment of this particular commutator and all, that building might be owned and controlled by the airport itself, the folks that use it might be contractors. So what kinds of things might they need in order to control their operations? And then as the owner of this operation, what kind of documentation would you want to see to make sure that they're doing it right? What kinds of things might you do? Don or Marcia, I'm not sure which one of you's watching the.
Yeah, nothing at this time, Angela.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, wait a minute.
Oh, there we go. Heidi's got comment log, a
Yep.
log for drivers making deliveries. Yep.
Yeah, that's really good. Another example might be somebody from the airport might want to come by and actually do a daily visual inspection. You might want signage with like an emergency number posted in case something goes wrong. All right, so if you don't have proper controls in place.
Angela, Julia's got one, permits for wastewater.
Yeah, absolutely. You'll need the proper permits for sure. Speaking of which, if you don't have proper controls, things like this happen. So we all know that the blue there is a chemical that they put into the lavatory wastewater. So seeing it there on top is not a good sign. This is a real life example. Marcia can probably tell you about this more than I can, but I'm going to go through it and she can interject as I miss things.
Yeah, and Angela,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Don. You can read it.
Yeah, Elizabeth, she state regular inspection of the operation of the commutator. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, commutator grinder. Let's just call it a grinder. It's easier to spell. Absolutely, yeah. And you can see what happens if you don't do that regular inspection here. So you can see the blue water kind of sitting there on top. All that white really is toilet paper. I wouldn't want to touch that hose with a 10-foot pole laying there in that water.
Heidi mentions cameras to monitor, so you can intervene when the issues are happening instead of following up after the fact. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great one, especially if it's like very remote from where the person who's in charge of this space is. A camera is a great tool that you can use to keep an eye on it if you can't get out there personally to see it in between. Good. So this is the inlet to this. This is the outlet. You can see it looks like there's drag out here. It also looks like some folks have gone in the wrong direction and come out the opposite side. What this is showing is that this comes down and around, and this is a storm drain. And you can see the toilet paper kind of goes all the way down to the storm drain. And this picture is to kind of show you this van over here. This little van right here is a contractor. It's not the contractor that deals with this, but they are the ones who called this in to the regulatory agency. So if you're not doing something right and you have contractors on site, be aware that they, if they see something wrong, they could potentially report that and it not be necessarily directly to you to do something about. So, keep things moving right in the first place, and they have nothing to report about you. So, seeing this, is this process being carried out as it was planned to be? No, of course not. Having those written instructions was just not enough. You have to make sure those controls are in place and that they're being carried out as planned. So what kind of checks might have prevented this before an audit? We've had a few good ones.
Angela, we have another comment
Sure.
from Heidi. The bar gate and an exit, so folks can't enter the exit. And the
So they
bar
can't come
raises
in
when, yeah, right. And the
the wrong
bar
direction.
raises when ready to exit. So yes.
Great. Yeah. That's a great one.
Yeah, Heidi, because we'll go through this, and this supposedly got fixed, but actually when DEQ went out there to do another inspection on a totally separate incident years later, while the inspection was happening, somebody went in the wrong way, and the airport person had to stop them in front of the inspector.
At least they did stop them.
Yes, yeah. Well, that was better than, not to digress, but that contractor was the one that made the complaint, and we knew when he made the complaint, and when we first investigated, the airport said it had only been broken that day. So be
Right.
truthful when the inspectors come on your site.
Exactly. Yeah, so part of the problem there was the commutator or the grinder was actually broken. And so they just didn't have, it wasn't flowing as well as it should have. And it's a very busy airport. And that was the only area of its type at the time.
Right.
So
And because it was, sorry, Angela, because it was a very busy airport, sometimes the contractors didn't want to wait. So I don't know if you're getting to this, Angela, but they also were using a separate manhole to
and just
not
dumping
go
it
through the
directly.
grinder. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll show them the after pictures, and that's where that one comes in.
Okay.
Yep. So anybody else have other kinds of checks? I love the idea of the camera, particularly in this area because it's so far removed from where the folks sit that are responsible for this. But what other kinds of things could be done?
Well, Heidi states regular inspections to determine if maintenance is needed for such a critical function.
Yep, absolutely. Like I mentioned before, it would have been good to have an emergency number so that when the first van that went through with the waste noticed that it was broken, they could call somebody immediately.
Michelle asks, is it possible to have an alarm if maintenance is needed?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great one. Anything that you can put in that makes it automatic.
And she follows up, perhaps just a flashing light that alerts the contractor. Yeah.
The other thing would be to have a backup plan. What are they going to do if it does break down? If that's the only place that they can go to get rid of this material, what could they do differently to make sure that that material doesn't get put down that manhole without being treated properly? maybe they have, you know, extra storage tank somewhere since they only had the one place. They did actually end up building another one with increased capacity later, but at the time they only had the one, so they needed a backup plan. Anything else on this one? We can show you some of the
No.
things they did.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, nothing at this time.
Okay. Oh. All right. So an indicator for implementation, you know, we said you have to show that you've implemented it. So the indicator that you've implemented those controls will be the checks that you ensure to make sure your process is being followed as planned. So some of the examples of that we've talked about, you know, checklists, supervisor walkarounds to make sure that things are operating properly, having those alarms and the cameras. So maybe having some sort of software validation or computer system.
Uh-oh, did we lose Angela?
I think so.
Hold on.
At least her audio, yeah.
It's showing she's still there. Well, folks, I'm hoping we didn't have Angela's computer, and we're trying to work on it. Yep, it says offline. So Angela's computer sometimes shuts down. So I will go ahead while she is booting back up probably. So we were talking about those indicators implementation. So she was talking about putting computer system in. Sometimes, you know, you hear that word SCADA. You know, some automated software that lets you know when the system is not working correctly. Making sure that it's calibrated, you know, is especially if you put those checks on, like, you know, having a high level alarm or something, calibrating any equipment that you've got that is related to that vital operation. Monitoring, measuring, analysis, and evaluation, right? So you're going to want to make sure that you're monitoring what you're doing. You can measure it somewhere. You're looking at the steps that you've put in and analyzing them to make sure that they're working like you wanted them to do, and you know, and you're doing that evaluation. And then the last piece you're going to look at is, you know, are there any competency checks or tests of employees that you're going to need to know? So especially if you make any changes to that system, you're going to want to make sure that you train the employees on how to correctly operate it, and then make sure they're competent and they are, you know, operating the system as per designed. So that could be training records, that could be, you know, an actual supervisor watching them and making sure and signing off before they're allowed to use any new equipment. Don, do we have anything else pop up?
No, not at this time.
Okay. All right, so hold on just a second because I'm going to change it so I'm presenting. So bear with me for a second. And I'll just have to get up to where she is. Don, you see the purple?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. All right, so indicators, I think that's where we were just now. Yep. Okay. And if we didn't have anybody else, we'll go on. So this is a picture of what it looked like after the airport prettied it up. And we went back out there to look at it. So you can see, you know, that grayed area, that's where the grinder is. That looks nice. You know, if there's been any overflow, you can see that they've washed it down there. There's nothing coming back. You can't really tell from this picture, but there's they added asphalt so that it's raised to create sort of a little berm. So it would impede it from coming back out through this entrance. And there's a close-up of that so you can see it. It's all looking like it's in great working order. There's that manhole that we were talking about that you had saw. So they had gotten so ingenious that they had put a little hatch in that manhole to make it easier for them not to use it like they should. So that now has a lock on it, so they can't get into that area anymore. And then inside the facility, they put up this signage, right? So it's what they're supposed to do when they're servicing the the lavatory carts or trucks. So one, they're supposed to follow the areas on the pavement so that they go in the way they're supposed to and they come out the rear. And then it talks about centering their equipment over the 4-inch hole in the grate, turning on the grinder switch to hand, opening the dump valve slowly. After your tank has been emptied, they're supposed to wash down the waste and the paper into the grate, and then they're supposed to close all the valves before exiting. And they're turn the grinder switch back to the off position.
Hey, I'm back.
Hey, you're back. Figured it
Sorry.
was, that's okay. So I'm in presenter mode. Just let me know if you want me to keep that and I'll just advance and you just want to talk.
Sure.
Okay.
Sorry, guys. I have a computer that chooses to freeze up on me now and then, and I can't help it. I just got a backup set up today, so I should have been using it. Alrighty. So, so you finished the example?
Yep. So I just advanced to this slide.
Perfect. Alrighty. So operational planning control, the organization shall control those planned changes and review consequences of unintended changes, taking action to mitigate any adverse effects. So it's, you know, fairly easy to think about things that are coming down the pike and to put plans in place. You know, you're going to add a line, you're going to put in a new building or whatever. But the thing is, a lot of environmental folks aren't involved in the planning piece up front. They get left out of those meetings. And they really should have a seat at the table in order to make sure that all of the environmental impacts are taken into account, including impacts to your EMS. You know, work instructions are you going to need, that kind of thing. So go ahead and advance, Marcia.
Angela, Marsha, Heidi had a question, I think, to the previous one. She states that's a lot of reliance on contractors. Are there any sensors that sound if they don't turn things off, or are misaligned over the gate, etc., or the grate, etc.?
Yeah, so that's a great point. And the way that worked is, you know, the airport owns the facility, but they then rent it out to the different airlines, and it's the airlines employees that were doing that. I don't remember there being any sensors that were sound other than like a high level alarm. But that was quite a few years ago. Probably about 12 now since this example came up. So there could have been, and I'm just not remembering them.
Okay. So like I said, you know, moving on to planned changes, they have to be controlled. The standard says that they have to be controlled. So the earlier you can get in on that process of knowing what's going to be changing, the easier it is for you to make sure that you've taken everything into account. You also have to take action to mitigate any adverse environmental effects as necessary. So, like I said, you know, maybe you're expanding your building and you're adding another space. You need to make sure that you're taking into account and mitigating those adverse effects from that. So you're increasing your stormwater runoff. So what are you doing to make sure that your stormwater retention pond is larger, or you're putting in another one, or doing something in order to mitigate that response? Those kinds of things you need to take into account while you're doing those new planned changes. So you actually need to create a procedure for dealing with those changes, both planned and unplanned. And we have a member who created this awesome new project checklist. So if you can advance to the next one, Marcia. You can see it here. And the thing we love about this is it takes into account all kinds of different environmental changes that could come about. And they go through in each one of these and they say, okay, can this new project do this? Can it do that, right? But at the end, you have an EMR they still have what they call an EMR. It's no longer a requirement in the standard, but they still have one, and that person is responsible for saying, yes, the project is acceptable with no environmental issues. It's acceptable. It's not acceptable because of the information provided, and maybe they need more, or maybe there's something that could cause a bigger impact than the company wants.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Looks like Angela went offline again. So she was just speaking to the EMR review, and she was saying, they can make a decision whether it's acceptable. There's no environmental areas that are affected. It's not acceptable, or it's acceptable with changes. And so they've got an area down there to talk about, if there were going to be changes, what would those be? And then once everyone has agreed to what their path forward is, they go ahead, they implement it, and then they say when those changes are totally complete, and everyone signs off on it. All right, so we're going to talk about operational planning and control. Let me just see. Oop. All right, so those, I thought there was more on this slide. That's what I was just advancing about. So
Marcia, we do have a comment from Julia. So what example of the project checklist added to the documents have you provided?
What is
She
an
hasn't
example of the
checked yet.
project?
Yeah.
Haven't. Okay, let me see if I can understand Julia's question. No, was there an example oh, so was there an example that was related to that, what we were showing? So the form that we were showing is anytime they have a plan changed, anytime they do a new project, they go through this to make sure that they catch all the areas in which that project could affect their EMS. So Julia, am I have I cleared that up a little bit?
Her last comment was yes. Here's,
Example of the
sorry for
new
the confusion, example of the new project checklist for us.
So one way, not the folks that created this checklist, but our friends that have the landfill and they have the household, they do multiple recycling facilities. They also have a management of change procedure, and they have a checklist. It's not quite like this. But one of their recent examples of a project they used it for was they were putting in, it's a rather large county near Charlotte. So they currently have 3 recycling centers, and they're putting in a 4th. So they used this checklist when they were installing their 4th recycling center.
Okay.
At their recycling centers, they take bulk trash from folks that live in the county. They also, it's a household hazardous waste drop-off area. So they'll take that. They also collect construction and demolition debris at these recycling centers. They also take used oil. So they used it to make sure that they were taking into all of those different ways that that new recycling center and the different waste that are being collected there needed to be managed through this change process.
There were a couple comments. One, is there a way that they can have a copy of the checklist, I guess, besides on the PowerPoint?
Oh yeah, we can,
Okay.
Donna, if you'll take a note, we can make
Yeah.
sure, I'm not sure what our handouts are for the next class, but we can either put it up as a handout for the next class, or we can send it out as an example for folks.
Yeah, I'm jotting down the note now.
Yeah, because this is also, I think we've included this in our design guidance manual, but we only gave you a PDF version of that because it's a little big.
And Julie
to
did
send.
say that's what she meant.
Okay.
And Cara, she's asked, is this form used as part of the aspect analysis or does this information feed into their aspect analysis?
They could do both. So this is right. This is new project. So you've probably already got your aspect list, your initial one done. But this could be a way that you could review that project or whatever you're doing to make sure it's not a new aspect that you have to add into your aspect list.
Okay. And another, talking about handouts, Elizabeth
Mhm.
asked, speaking of handouts, I didn't download a presentation file from last week. Could we make that available again?
Yeah, Elizabeth, if you'll just shoot us an email, we'll send that directly to you.
Okay.
All right. Okay. All right, so back to operational planning and control. The standard says that the organization shall ensure that your outsourced processes are controlled or influenced, and the type of extent of control or influence to be applied to the processes shall be defined within your EMS. So we've introduced a new term here, so outsource process, and we'll go over in just a little bit what are the 4 things you need to look at for an sorry, can't speak, outsource process. And then once you determine if you have any outsourced processes, you have to determine the type and extent of control or influence you have over it, and that you're going to document in your EMS. All right, so an outsourced process, and let me just see, because I don't do this one all the time. Let me just get all the little definitions up here. So an outsourced process is one that fulfills all of the following. So it falls within the scope of your environmental management system. It is integral to the organization's functioning. It is needed for the environmental management system to achieve its intended outcome. The liability for conforming to requirements is retained by the organization, and the organization and the external provider have a relationship where the process is perceived by interested parties as being carried out by the organization. Okay, and these are spelled out in the standard, and all of these need to apply for something to be considered an outsourced process. So an example, going back to our landfill folks, at those recycling centers, up until recently, they had a contractor was the one who managed that intake and management of the household hazardous waste. Now, if you drove up as a citizen, you wouldn't know whether that person worked for the county or worked for that contractor. So in that instance, all of these things would apply because the county, it was within the scope of their environmental management system, right? It was happening at one of their facilities. It was integral to the organization's function, right? So they're a waste organization. They're the ones that take the waste. So that's integral to what they do. It was needed for their environmental management system to achieve its intended outcomes, right? So they're taking the responsibility for that household hazardous waste, and they need to manage it properly so that nothing happens to it. One, when they're taking it from the customer, but two, that it's packaged correctly and it goes off to the right disposal location. And the liability for conforming with the regulatory requirements is retained by the county. And then, like I said, no one driving up would know who that provider was, whether it was the county or the contractor. So all those apply. So that's a great example of an outsourced process. Another one we have is we have a big pulp and paper manufacturer as one of our members. And so they have a process where they take their waste and they mix it with some woody fibers and they make a compost out of it. But they have a contractor that does all of that. So same thing, it's within the scope of their EMS. They have the liability for doing it. But the person, like when I went and did a tour of their facility, I had no idea whether that was the paper company or the consultant. And then another example is at a wastewater treatment plant. We've got some members that they contract out the management of their sludge. and the land application of it. So again, that belongs to the organization. It's within their EMS. They're still liable. They hold the permits for the land application, but they've got a contractor that does all of the operations to make sure they're in compliance. All
I'm
right.
back, and I'm on a different computer now.
All right. It's all good. I've been standing in okay for you.
Yeah. This is why it's always good to have a backup and a backup plan.
Yes.
All righty.
All right. So we
Yeah,
just went over the definition of outsourced process, and I gave examples of Mecklenburg household hazardous waste,
yep. I heard
wastewater
you.
treatment plant. Okay, good. All right. I'm going to go to
Yeah,
the
I have
next
one more if you
slide.
want it.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so we have one industrial facility that makes kind of small vehicles, think like a gator or like a golf cart kind of thing. And so they get parts in and they do some assembly to them, and then those parts go into a painting process and then come back out of that painting process and the assembly is finished. And that painting process, which is fully housed within the building, there's no separation, there's no gap in the line at all, but that painting process is an outsourced process for them. They don't own it. It's completely a separate operation as far as the employees go. However, it's in their building, it's part of their process. So it meets all of those requirements of an outsourced process. And anybody walking through the building wouldn't know any different whether or not it's the owner's folks doing that job or the contracted folks. So, all righty. So let's see, have you moved on now?
I have, but I need to pull up all of your things so folks can see it. There you go.
All righty. So the next piece here of outsourced processes, you need to identify processes that are outsourced in order to be sure and make sure that you look at the providers of your products and services. You want to define the type and extent of the control or influence that you have over them. You know, some of the ways that you can control that might be through contract agreements, especially if it's a vendor that's working on site. It's easy to create those contracts from the get-go so they know exactly what the expectations are. It can be done through your procurement process. You might just have a really good working relationship with the contractors so that they take part in any of the training that you're offering your own employees, particularly when it relates to the EMS. You might audit your contractors, you know, go out to their sites and make sure that they're doing everything appropriately. You might require them to have an EMS of their own, and that can be part of the control. You might provide the control equipment that they use just, you know, for their own operations, right? So they're doing it at your site, so you want to make sure that they have the proper equipment, so you provide that for them. And then you might have regular meetings with the contractors. You know, we have some folks that they have a lot of contractors on site, and so it's kind of a 3-year process where they'll pull about a third of their contractors and do an audit of their entire system each year, just to make sure that they're following all the requirements that are within their contract and that they're meeting, you know, the EMS requirement, because they require them to have that training and all. Okay, you can go forward. So when you're defining the type and extent of control, things you want to think about are your own environmental aspects and impacts. You know, how does the outsource process play into those? What kind of training the folks might need? Your risks and opportunities. You know, same thing. Are these contractors going to be a risk to you if something goes wrong? So you might want to actually include them within your risks and opportunities. And also, as an opportunity, you have the ability to maybe influence their culture. You know, if you're requiring them to have an EMS for you, it's not going to just apply to you. They're going to have an EMS for everything that they do. So that's an opportunity to expand on that. Your objectives, of course, if they can affect your goals in any way, and your compliance obligations. So anything regulatory and other things that you've put into place, whether that's, you know, being part of Energy Star or our program or something else, any of those compliance obligations that you've agreed to meet. Next. So we have created a bunch of different forms. They're all in that design guidance document that we keep pointing to. This isn't necessarily something that you're required to do, but it might be helpful when you're first trying to figure out who your who your outsourced processes are. So you can just kind of go through and list them in this form. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't, that's fine too. It's like I said, it's not a requirement to have this document, but it might help you in organizing your thoughts. So next. All right, the next piece is life cycle again. So we talked about life cycle last time with respect to aspects and impacts. You also need to think about life cycle when you're talking about operational planning and control. So again, consistent with that life cycle that we discussed, you have to establish controls to make sure that your environmental requirements are being addressed in all of those stages. So the design, the development process, each life cycle stage. Then you need to determine its environmental requirements for the procurement of your product. So that's that purchasing piece. And you need to communicate your relevant environmental requirements to any of those external providers, including your contractors. So they need to know what your environmental requirements are going to be of them. So how are you going to do that communication? Through that contracting process or your purchasing agreements, that's probably the easiest way to get that ball rolling, although you might require some additional training or something to that. You want to consider the need to provide that information about your potential significant environmental impacts that are associated with your products and services, including that transportation and delivery piece, any use issues, end of life treatment, or final disposal. So you need to think about what kind of information you might need to provide on your significant aspects to the folks that do those pieces for you. And then the organization shall maintain documented information. So you do have to have some document to the extent necessary to have confidence that the processes have been carried out as planned. So what kinds of records or procedures or work instructions are you going to create in order to make sure that things are being done the way they are meant to be done in order to achieve the goals of your EMS? All right, next.
Okay, Angela, I know because you and I were popping back and forth, is this the slide where we define what an environmental requirement is usually? Because I think this may be the first place that pops up, or no?
Yes. We have a whole section on, I'm sorry, I'm going back to my slides to look and see what's coming up.
Yeah, maybe it's in the next slide where we define it. Okay,
yeah, it's the next slide.
Sorry.
Sorry, folks. A little inside baseball. All right. So the next piece is going to talk about environmental requirements. So this is new to the standard, them calling out specific environmental requirements and using that language. And it's weird because it's only within this operational control section that they use this terminology. So when they use that, and this is from the annex, what they're talking about is environmental requirements being the organization's environmentally related needs and expectations that it establishes for and communicates to its interested parties. So that means you have to think about who your stakeholders are, who those interested parties are that you defined back at the beginning of your journey down this EMS path, and figure out what it is that they need. So this could be like a customer requirement that the materials that you're creating have a certain level of post-consumer recycled content. It could be a requirement that they put on you that you do not use VOCs in their product. You know, it can be anything along those lines that they have told you that they want and that you do because they ask you to. And then you have to communicate to them that you've done it in some way, right? So you usually have to certify that you've done that for them. So any of those kinds of things that you have established for and communicate to your interested parties. So that even includes our program. So we have an annual report that's required, right? So you're establishing goals, you're establishing an EMS because we've asked you to. It's also, good for your business to do so. But then you're communicating back to us your progress towards those goals, right? And you're communicating to us as an interested party. So what kind of environmental requirements might you guys have? Has anybody thought about that? What kinds of things do your interested parties expect you to do, and then you tell them about them? Any examples out there?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, let's move on. Maybe some will come to you. So here are some examples that we've come up with. Maybe you've had a vendor or a customer tell you that they don't want you to use any hazardous substances. Maybe it's an employee issue. Maybe it's a safety issue for you. And so your interested parties there would be your employees, right? So that you have a agreement that you will not have hazardous substances in your product, right? Maybe someone has asked you to increase your recycling. Walmart has pushed that down to a lot of their vendors of late. They make them fill out these big surveys and to have them, reduce their packaging and all of that. And they have to respond to those surveys. So all of those things could potentially become environmental requirements. Maybe you have to reduce the waste that's brought into your facility. Maybe that's part of one of your objectives to go to zero waste to landfill.
Hey,
Or
Angela, we've got a,
yeah.
I'm sorry, we had
No,
a
you're
couple
fine.
comments.
Sure.
Carl states, research to protect human health and the environment. And Chad, the requirement to purchase 95% EPEAT, E-P-E-A-T, certified electronics.
Yeah, those are great ones. Absolutely. Yep. Okay. So you can just see some of these examples that we've come up with. Even this use locally thing. We've got some more coming. So Marcia, you want to forward on?
Yep.
All right. Oops. Trying to find my own cursor. Sorry. So once you figured out, what your requirements are, some ways that you might find those. You might want to refer to a list of needs and expectations from your interested parties that you developed back in the beginning. You might want to refer to your list of compliance obligations, all of those regulatory requirements and those other requirements that you have agreed to meet. What kind of environmental requirements have you established for your own organization, like that, no hazardous waste comes into the building or no hazardous materials come into the building. What kind of requirements are necessary in order to achieve the goals that you're setting. We have a facility that requires any contractor coming on site to take away any waste materials that they create. So they can't use their dumpsters or trash cans. If they have a piece of waste that they create, they have to take it with them so that they never are increasing the amount of waste that they have to deal with in their zero waste to landfill goal. Okay. Next. All right. So the next part of the standard says that you should establish goals as appropriate to ensure that the environmental requirements are addressed in the design and development process for the product or service, considering each life cycle stage. So an example of that is if you have an environmental requirement to minimize waste, you want to look at all of those stages of the life cycle to find out where you could potentially reduce waste at every level. So this is right up our alley as far as source reduction goes. Can you minimize the waste from the beginning so that you don't have to deal with it on the backside, right? So can you minimize that waste in the development of the product, or can you reduce the packaging, both incoming and outgoing? Can you increase the longevity of the product so that it reduces the number of those things that end up in the landfill in the first place? So for each of those life cycle stages, you want to implement controls in order to design or develop a product that meets your environmental requirements. All right, next. All right, so we have a facility in our program that makes tobacco products. I mean, we are North Carolina, so it is expected. And they are known for having organic products. So they're a smaller company. They're part of a larger entity, of course, but this particular entity, they are all about having that organic, sustainably grown tobacco. So they have to put processes in place to make sure that the correct tobacco comes into them, that they are evaluating those farmers to make sure that those farms are truly organic, that they use as much locally grown as possible. They do get some from outside just to make sure that, you know, if some blight comes along, that they do have product. But they put in all these different controls in order to make sure that they are meeting that customer requirement. And then they put, you know, again, you know, you're communicating with that interested party, in this case it's their customer, that it is truly organic and sustainably grown by putting the certifications on their packaging. All right, next. And again, this is just a form that you can use if you want to. It's in that design guidance, but this is just how you communicate your relevant requirements to your external provider. So it's just a way for you to capture what the requirement is, what controls are necessary, what your implementation indicator is, and then how you will communicate that out to any external parties. So, all right, next. And then this is all about your external provider. So this is a way for you to evaluate your contractors, right? So just like we had that form for evaluating new projects that are coming in, this is a way for you to actually look at contractors and evaluate them and make sure that they are meeting your EMS requirements, right? It's a checklist that you can go through each one of your contractors, and then they have to sign off that they have received this information or training, however you decide to do it, and that they will abide by it. So it's one of those means of control that you can implement for folks that are outside of your own employees. All right, next. All right. And then you also have to consider the need to provide information about your potential significant environmental impacts that are associated with transportation, delivery, use, end of life, final disposal of the product. So an example might be an oil refinery that determines that transportation and delivery of its product has potential significant impact. So that refinery determines the need to provide information to its transporters on best management practice to avoid potential significant aspects. So they might give them some safety training on driver safety training, or like Heidi was talking about before, having the hoses connect to the different areas where they're delivering it be different, so that you can't, for example, put diesel fuel in a gasoline tank, right? So we've all seen that those are actually not the same size.
Well, Angela, now that you brought up Heidi, she's got a comment. I work in product substance compliance right now. I often encounter parts with non-compliant substances. Unfortunately, there is often a disconnect between starting to use the part in production and discovering that the part contains too much lead, cadmium, or whatever. The feedback loop is broken because the folks collecting compliance declarations from suppliers and the folks on the line initiating production.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. So that communication piece is critical, especially if you're you're dealing with contractors, and that's where that contract and purchasing agreements really comes in play. You know, if you're requiring them to do things a certain way and you discover that they aren't, then at least you have some way of saying, hey, look, this is what you agreed to and we can't buy that. Now, granted, you know, that causes issues for your supply chain. So again, always good to have a backup.
Yeah, she adds it can lead to recalls, which are, of course, expensive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Good example. Okay. Another example we've got here is the company making electronic equipment that could contaminate groundwater if it ended up in a landfill. So the company decides to put into place a take-back program so that anybody who has a broken product can send it back to them, and then they recycle it properly so it doesn't go to a landfill and contaminate groundwater. All right. I think that's it, Marcia. All right. Does anybody have any questions about anything that we've talked about today? Operational control, documentation. Dawn, you talked about all of the competence training awareness kinds of pieces.
And communication.
And communication, yes. Mm-hmm. Anybody have anything?
Excuse me.
Nothing yet.
All right.
Yeah, so I just have a couple of items for us. So we will check which handouts we have or we're going to load for the last class. And if we have an open slot, we'll put up that management of change form so you guys can download it. But like we said, that our design guidance manual, it's a fairly big Excel file, and I believe it gets blocked on our end by the size limitation that DEQ sets. And usually we hand that out to folks on a zip drive when we were doing this, because usually we were doing it in person. But if there's anything, if you go through that design guidance and there's like a specific form or something in there, you've got our email, which is Angela, NCESI, or is it just, it's ESI?
It's ESI. Yeah, ESI@ncdner.gov. That's the easiest one to remember.
We do have a question from Pamela. Are all of the documentation requirements annually or as needed?
Depends on how you write it into your own system. So as needed.
Yeah, so the standard does not in any of those shall statements for documentation have a time frame. So when an organization implements an EMS, you get to say how often you're going to review things. And as Angela said, I think in one of the other, a lot of times you'll see it spelled out as annually. So at least once a year you're doing something to make sure that folks are looking at your system and you're reviewing things. But yep, it's really up to the organization on how often they want to do something, because often you'll see annual for management review, but less often or more often for other things within the system.
Exactly. Anything else?
Pamela says thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
That's right. Anytime.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely reach out to us. I will look and see if we can actually post the Excel version versus the PDF version of the
that's a good idea.
the design guidance.
Thought about that. Yeah.
I'm not sure what the size is, but if it's below a certain number of megabytes, I might be able to post it into the handouts next time. So I'll look at that.
Okay.
All right. Next time will be the last class. So Thank you all who have sat through all of them. We will be posting them all up after next week's class onto our website, and we'll send out a link to anybody who registered. So, if somebody couldn't make one of them, we'll hopefully have links for everything. We'll put links to all the documents. So if you missed a class, you'll have that as well. Alrighty. Thank you all for attending, and I am so sorry about my computer issues. More than you know.
Kara had a comment before we all leave. She said,
Yeah.
agencies shall adhere to the requirements of the Made in America laws in making clean energy, energy efficiency, and clean energy procurement decisions. So that might be a federal level requirement. So I don't know if that was an executive order or if that's codified into law. New executive order. That must have been one of the many that have been issued since we've had the changing of the administrations. Thank you.
Yep. Good deal. Good examples.
Yes. All right, folks. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you all next week.